Hello, and we are back. Welcome to our channel, Get Legit LLC, where we discuss all things legal when it comes to events and happenings in social media, on reality TV, and in the entertainment industry at large. Thank you all for joining our channel. This is a very new channel. I am about 2 months old, and so there you have it on the screen, our disclaimer as it relates to fair use and our belief, our honest belief, that the copyrighted materials being used herein is being used as it relates to for educational purposes. And so we just ask you all to please hit that like and subscribe and notification button. Thank you all again for listening to our channel. Without any further ado, today's discussion is the one and only, a young woman whom I recently started to follow and listen to her podcasts. I don't agree with all of her commentaries, and there are some that I do agree with. However, I find this one very mind-boggling as it relates to Kim Kardashian and her mother, Kris Jenner. According to Candace Owens, she said, Kim Kardashian is a prostitute and her mother, Kris Jenner, is a pimp. Now, for those of you who follow things in social media, you would have known about Ray J claim as it relates to the sex tape he and Kim Kardashian made. And so based on Ray J's claim, Candace Owens made this comment on her podcast, and a lot of people, I must say, agreed with her, and which is their right. Everyone has their opinion. And so let's get into the legal issues surrounding this comment. And so this commentary is just for us to see whether or not the law supports Candace's statement. So does it? Let's see. The rationale is, the argument here is, if you say someone is a prostitute and pimp based on what Ray J said, then you are arguably saying the event or events amount to prostitution. So let's get legal. How does the law define prostitution? For the purpose of this video, so those of you who might be making comments as it relates to other states, please bear in mind that when it comes to our definition of prostitution, I am solely looking at the California Penal Code 647B. 647B reads, an individual who solicits or who agrees to engage in or who engages in any act of prostitution with the intent to receive compensation, money, or anything of value from another person. An individual agrees to engage in an act of prostitution when, with specific intent to so engage, the individual manifests an acceptance of an offer or solicitation by another person to so engage, regardless of whether the offer or solicitation was made by a person who also possessed the specific intent to engage in an act of prostitution. So that is how the California Penal Code defines prostitution. So for those of you who might need further clarification with what we look at it, what it prohibits, by prohibits, you mean what it tries to stop and say you can't do: engaging in an act of prostitution, soliciting an act of prostitution, and agreeing to engage in an act of prostitution. Under the penal code, my apologies, under case law, solicit under this statute means tempt someone, lure someone, or try to obtain something from someone. And the case it cites there is People v. Smith, 1955, for California, 44 California. And let's list the page. So for those of you who would like to read the case, it is a very short case. I believe it's 2 pages long. You could find it on Google and you could read it for yourself. In that case, you're going to see how they came to the definition as to what it means to solicit. So let's go further. Continuing on prostitution. So here we list you engage in an act of prostitution, soliciting an act of prostitution, agreeing to engage in an act of prostitution. For purposes of all of these acts, prostitution is where a person has sexual intercourse or does a lewd act with someone else in exchange for money or other compensation. It goes on. What is prostitution? Okay, so when you look at it in a summary form, it continues to explain the different elements as it relates to when you say money, compensation. And you're going to see from the definition, it says anything of value. So it does not necessarily has to just be monetary compensation. The penal code goes on. We read above as it relates to the definition. I read 647B. So there is a further subsection which is 6474. And 6474 reads, it says here, a manifestation of acceptance of an offer or solicitation to engage in an act of prostitution does not constitute a violation of this subdivision unless some act in addition to the manifestation of acceptance is done within this state in furtherance of the commission of the act of prostitution by the person manifesting an acceptance to an offer or solicitation to engage in that act. As used in this subdivision, prostitution includes any lewd act between persons for money or other compensation. So if you look at other compensation, it is wide. So it does not solely mean whatever act you're engaging in for the sole purpose of collecting money. It could be anything money's worth. It goes on. So just to give you all a summary of what is prostitution, it says prostitution is the crime of willfully engaging in sexual intercourse or a lewd act with someone else in exchange for money or something else of value. It goes on as it relates to what is a lewd act. Some of you might be asking, what is that? A lewd act or lewd conduct means touching a person's private part, or either the prostitute or the customer with some part of the other person's body for the purpose of sexual arousal or sexual gratification. And it goes on. A lewd act is any sexual activity or contact between a prostitute and a customer that involves the following body parts, and it's done for the purpose of either sexual arousal or sexual gratification. So it's the genitals, the buttocks, or the female breasts. So that constitutes a lewd act. When you talk about prostitution now, remember Candace Owens said Kim's mother is a pimp. So there are several crimes connecting to prostitution. So those crimes that are connected to prostitution are: 1, human trafficking, and I note the penal code for that specific offense; pimping, which falls under penal code 266H; pandering, which I will explain later on in this presentation; loitering with the intent to commit prostitution, penal code 653, which has now been repealed. All right, so note that. So the loitering with intent to commit prostitution has been repealed, which means taken back, no longer an illegality. That's what repeal means. Repeal means you take it back, so it's no longer there. Supervising or aiding a prostitute, which is penal code 653.23. So for those of you who might be wondering, so why would Candace said Kim is a prostitute and her mother is a pimp? Because the related offenses to prostitutions are here. These 4 basically. Is prostitution legal? You might be asking. The answer is no. No. It is not legal. All right. It is a misdemeanor and carries a fine of $1,000 and or imprisonment of 6 months. So where you see and or, what that means, it could be both. So it could either be a fine of $1,000 and 6 months imprisonment. It could be both the person serves, or it could be either one of them. So a person who is found guilty of prostitution in California, the court could say, okay, because of the circumstances, we're going to give you a fine and imprisonment, which means the person has to pay $1,000 up to $1,000, which means $1,000 is the threshold. They will not go above $1,000. So it could be below 1,000, but it stops at 1,000 based on this legislation, the reading of this legislation. And then where it says 6 months in county jail, then it says up to 6 months in county jail. That means you could get a month, you could get 2 months, you could get 3 months, because the word is up to 6 months. It's not saying 6 months outright. It's saying up to 6 months, which means based on the circumstances of the case, the court could say, okay, I found you guilty. I'm going to give you a imprisonment of 1 month or 2 months or 3 months. Or they could say 1 month and no fine. Or they could say 1 month and a fine of maybe $500, maybe $100. So it all depends. So when you see and or, it means the court, it all depends on the court. The court could say and, which means you do both, or it be or, which means you do one. All right. So who is a pimp? Let's see whether or not Kris Jenner is a pimp based on what Candace Owens is saying. It says a pimp, except as provided in subdivision B, any person who, knowing another person is a prostitute, lives or derives support or maintenance in whole or in part from the earnings or proceeds of the person's prostitution, or from money loaned or advanced to or charged against that person by any keeper or manager or inmate of a house or other place where prostitution is practiced or allowed, or who solicits or receives compensation for soliciting for the person, is guilty of pimping, a felony, and shall be punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for 3, 4, or 6 years. So if you note, when it comes to pimping, the courts look at this more seriously, as opposed to where prostitution, there is the possibility of the person just getting a fine, or the person getting a fine and imprisonment. When it comes to pimping, all it says here, 3, 4, or 6 years, which means the person can be sentenced to 3 years, 4 years, or 6 years. Based on my research, I have not seen any possibility of a fine. And so this tells you how seriously this offense is. So we go to the next slide. Summary of who is a pimp. So first element, you knew that a certain person was a prostitute, and one or more of the following was true. 1, the money that the prostitute earned supported the defendant, either in whole or in part. The money loaned to the prostitute by someone who ran a house of prostitution supported the defendant, either in whole or part. Or the defendant asked for or received payment from the prostitute for soliciting prostitution customers. So there you have it. That is a summary of who is a pimp. Let's analyze what Reggie said. Remember now, we started off saying based on what Candace Owens said. Her opinion is, in her opinion, Kim Kardashian and Kris Jenner. Kim Kardashian is a prostitute, Kris Jenner is a pimp. So let's analyze what Reggie said to see, having looked at the definition and the elements that needs to be there in order for those offenses to be proved. Let's see whether or not this amount to prostitution or pimping. What did Reggie say? Just for us to recap. He said that there is a contract with the purchaser, which means when he said that there is a contract, you would have an offer being made by somebody, an acceptance of that offer, consideration, which means two of our minds meet, that we know what you know what, I know what you're offering, I know what I'm accepting too, and we're on the same page. Basically saying we are on the same page. I understand fully what this offer is, and I understand fully what my acceptance is. And the last element, we intend for there to be a legal relationship, which means there's an intention to be bound. Because if you look into law, you're going to find that there are certain relationships where the court could say that there was no intention to be bound. All right, but if you look at this relationship now, Kim and Ray J, boyfriend and girlfriend, that could be very well one of the issues you look at, whether or not there was an intention to be bound. But remember, this contract, according to Ray J, was entered into by both of them with a third party. So the inclusion of the third party could raise the issue, or not raise the issue, but answer the issue as to whether or not there was an intention to be bound. Because you might first look at say, oh, but those two were boyfriend and girlfriend, so maybe between themselves there is no intention, but they didn't sign any agreement between themselves. They signed an agreement with a third party. So my opinion, there is an intention. There was an intention to be bound. The second element, it says they both signed separate contracts with the purchaser. That's according to Ray J. He showed us his contract and he said Kim got the same identical contract, which means two contracts you're looking at right away, two separate contracts. If Ray J cannot show you a copy of Kim's contract, then really and truly you don't know what she signed for. So, because it does not mean that both of them signed the same contract, but that's for whatever case, if there is a case. So he's talked about the first video, and the second video and a third video, which entitled, based on what I saw on the contract, from what Ray J showed us, it says Cabo Intro, Cabo Sex, and third video, Santa Barbara. Then he said Kris Jenner decided which video to sell. They sold the video and they both collected $400,000. Well, bear in mind, Ray J cannot speak for what Kim Kardashian collected. He can only speak for what he signed in his contract. People, if you haven't seen Kim's contract, then you know what? I will not say how much she collected, because really, seeing is believing. Wait until you see her contract. Wait until you see a contract that they say, okay, this is Kim's contract and it has $400,000 on it. Then you say, oh yeah, Kim collected $400,000. But for now, what we're going on, what Ray J said, okay? So based on what he said, we look at these issues next, which is it an issue of prostitution or pornography, or an issue of pimping or pandering? Remember I listed earlier above different related offenses when it comes to prostitution, and pimping being one of them and pandering being the other, as well as human trafficking and so on. Then what you need to look at when you're looking at this is whether or not what Ray J said, this whole transaction, was it prostitution or was it pornography? And when it comes to Kris Jenner, was it that she was pimping her daughter, or was it pandering? So you have to look at the legal issues and look at the legal definition to determine if really and truly there is prostitution. Because of what? Look, if there is no prostitution, then guess what? There is no pimping, there is no pandering. So you have to start to see whether or not there was prostitution. And if your answer is, I don't think there was prostitution, then they can't be pimping and pandering. If you said, yeah, I think there is prostitution, then the next element you look to see, well, who was the pimp, who pandered? Okay, so Ray J did not say that Ray J, paid Kim Kardashian to engage in the act. All right, so Ray J is not telling us that he paid Kim for them to do this video. Ray J stated a third party paid for the video, and they shot a second and third videos. Kim Kardashian looked and determined which to sell. I mean, Kris Jenner looked at the videos and determined which one to sell. So right away we're saying Ray J was not a customer, because Ray J is not saying that I paid her. All right, so Ray J is not a customer if you're of the position that Kim is a prostitute. Ray J is not a customer because he's not saying I paid. However, what he is saying is that we did the act, a third party paid us. So interesting would be, can it be prostitution if a third party is paying? Continue on, people, continue on. It gets juicy. What is pornography? Just so that we could have it in context. When we talk about these issues, I like to put it in context in terms of what is a legal definition, okay? So, depiction of nudity or sexual behavior which is intended to arouse sexual gratification in the viewer. drawings, paintings, videos, magazines, okay? So the intent with pornography is to arouse sexual gratification. So pornography, the intent is to sexually arouse the viewer. Prostitution, the intent is to be paid for services rendered to the person paying, or a third party person paying, since the intent is not to stimulate. So let me read that again. Pornography, the intent is to sexually arouse the viewer. So we're doing this act, but our intent to do this act is so that whoever watches us doing this act gets aroused sexually, all right? Prostitution, the intent is to be paid, collect money, collect your cheese, cha-ching, to be paid for services rendered to the person paying, or a third party person paying, since the intent is not to stimulate. So your intent to making the video, whatever you made, would have been, I'm collecting, either from the person I'm doing the service to or from a third party. All right? What is pandering, you might ask? You could always find pandering in California Penal Code 266I. It says, any person who does any of the following is guilty of pandering. 1. Procures another person for the purpose of prostitution by promises, threats, violence, or by any device or scheme, causes, induces, persuades, or encourages another person to become a prostitute. What is pandering? Pandering, the actions here for pandering, you procure another person, and you're procuring of that person for the purpose of prostitution. And how you procure them? Through promises. You either threaten them, you commit violence against them, or by any device or scheme. And what happened as a result of that? It causes, or it induces, or it persuades, or it encourages another person to become a prostitute. So, hence the reason I ask, is it pimping or pandering? Is it prostitution or pornography? Remember, if you say no, it's not prostitution, then hey, guess what? You can't look at pimping, you can't look at pandering, because those stems from the first one being that there is prostitution. But if you're saying, like Candace Owens has said, that yeah, I believe it's prostitution, then you can look further and see whether or not, or ask yourself whether or not what Kris Jenner did was she was a pimp or she was a panderer. Was she pimping or was she pandering? So look at the definition, people, and come to your conclusion. Pandering, and it goes on. So you procures for another person a place as an inmate in a house of prostitution, or as an inmate of any place in which prostitution is encouraged or allowed within the state, by promises, threats, violence, or by any device or scheme, causes, induces, persuades, or encourages an inmate of any house of prostitution or any other place in which prostitution is encouraged or allowed to remain therein as an inmate. So now this is dealing with the place, the locality where it takes place, okay? So it goes further as it relates to the procurers of another person, a place, so the location, we're probably going to this thing, and it has to be within the state, all right? So people, you have enough information to make a decision for yourself as to whether or not you believe it's pimping, pandering, prostitution, or pornography. Pandering definition continues in the legislation. It says, and it continues with the elements, by fraud or artifice, or by duress of person,